Welcome back in, everybody. Still the 21 off season. Kansas City Chiefs, still the offensive line. There's so much to talk about. We've already done one video just at the same time we're doing this one that covers the starters for 2021, who we think might be started and playing where, and we looked at the finances for 2021. So this video really is much more looking long-term down the road for the next 3 to 4 seasons and looking back over the last 5 or 6 seasons. And I know this is kind of a boring kind of a topic here that I'm fixing to talk about, but this is kind of where you start to talk about football theory and philosophy, and where I personally differ not only from the Kansas City Chiefs, but from a lot of teams really in the NFL. And I'll also talk about the reasons why. But let's bring it back down to earth a little bit and talk about Kansas City Chiefs offensive line looking kind of beyond 2021. And here's what you've got. Basically, you've got Joe Thuney. I'll talk extensively about the Thuney deal at the end of this video, because I know some of you may or may not want to hear that part of it. But you've got Joe Thuney, who's going to anchor this offensive line, in theory, for the next 3 to 5 years. He's excellent. He's solid. He should be your starting left guard for the next few seasons. After that, you've got Nick Allegretti, who is signed up for a couple more seasons. He looks like he could be a starter at the right guard spot. We already saw him do that in 2020. Maybe he could do that for the next couple of seasons at the right guard spot, or perhaps even some people have bounced around the idea of him moving to center. I haven't seen him in the practices enough to know whether or not that's even a viable thought or not. I don't see a problem with it, but of course I haven't seen him up close to talk about that. And then you have Niang, who drafted 3rd round out of Texas Christian an off season ago, hasn't got on the NFL football field yet, but we're holding out every hope that he can land the starting tackle job. That's 3 guys who are all relatively young, anywhere from, say, 23 years old to 28 years old for Thuney, relatively young, and who you project could possibly be your starters for the next 3 years. After that, though, and here's where it really kicks in huge, after that, none of these 10 guys is on the roster signed for a contract past this season, after 2021. That is, every one of these other guys come next off season, you either have to make a decision on them all over again about whether or not to even try to have them come back, or if you want them back, you have to renegotiate another deal with them. And with some guys, that would be easier than with others. But Blythe is on a 1-year deal, signed as a free agent. Wiley signed the 1-year tender. He'll be a full-fledged free agent next offseason. Rimmer signed a 1-year deal. Dr. Laurent will finally be off of his rather long contract next offseason. He'll be a free agent. Kyle Long was only signed to a 1-year deal. Rankin's contract will be over after next season, and Witzman was only signed to a 1-year deal. So before we draft anybody, and they may draft a guy or two in the draft this year on offensive line, we'll see. We're still before the draft. But as of right now, out of your 10 primary guys heading into the 21 season, only 3 of them are signed beyond 2021. All the rest of the guys are gone, and they're back up for grabs for other NFL teams. And it's up to you to try to decide to bring them back or not bring them back, or get them at a sweet price or not bring them back at a sweet price. And right here is what the Chiefs are doing basically for this season, and maybe for the next couple of seasons. They're using, I don't want to call it a stars and scrubs approach, because it's not quite that bad, but financially that's basically what they're doing. They're putting in a lot of money in the pot here for Thuney, a guy who's going to anchor that offensive line, and then they're just kind of patchworking the rest of it, at least before this NFL draft kicks in. Now, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I talk all the time about how I don't mind NFL teams, or any team, anybody, anywhere in life, trying different ways of doing things. And some ways are really bad and horrendous and should never have been tried in the first place. Other ways are still good. They're just not the way I would do it. This is not the way I would do it. It's not the way I would ever have done this offensive line, going back to even before Brett Veach was the general manager. We'll do that in just a second. Basically what they've got going on here, they've got one guy for sure who is above average, who can hold down a starting spot, and you're paying him a boatload of money to do that. And then everybody else in the offensive line, you're hoping that they can hold up and be average. And you're also hoping that maybe next offseason you can do that again with some of these guys, because you're going to have to. Even if you do draft a couple of people and they work out, you still have a number of guys here that you've got to make decisions. So doing that every offseason, having the one mega guy who's making a lot of money, and then everybody else is making itty bitty money, and they're on 1-year deals or their contracts are running out, it gets a little difficult to try to do that every offseason, right? And Kansas City hasn't been doing that. They've had the 2 bookend tackles, and then they've had the kind of patchworked the interior of the offensive line over the past couple of off seasons. But this is the ship that they're in right now. And the reason that they're in this boat, I said we'd look back over the past 4 or 5 seasons. Over the past 5 years, the Chiefs have had 33 draft picks and have only drafted 3 offensive linemen. All right, out of 33 draft picks, they've only spent 3 of those picks on the offensive line. And it gets a little bit worse, actually, percentage-wise, if you go back for the last 6 seasons. Again, that's before Brett Veach was even general manager. When you go back that far, the past 6 seasons, 42 draft picks, and only 4 of them spent on the offensive line. Now, here's where really I and a lot of NFL teams part ways. My preference is, and I've seen this on several occasions, my preference is to draft at least 1 offensive lineman in every draft, if not 2. It's just a good way of doing business. Now, I know some of you are looking at me like, Ben, why are you so stuck on this? Why have you kind of planted your flag here and you just stubbornly refuse to move off of it? Well, the reason why is this. It's not just about the fact that you have one guy this season and it's a bit of a transition year and yet you're kind of rebuilding the offensive line again. Had the Chiefs done it my way, quote unquote, if I could arrogantly, obnoxiously stick that in, had they done it my way, starting 5 and 6 years ago, had they been drafting 1 to 2 offensive linemen a year, the result would be that right now, even as we head into the new waters of the Mahomes contract, they would have an offensive line that would be younger and cheaper and more financially flexible than the one they have right now. Perhaps not more financially flexible because so many of these guys are off their contracts, but it would definitely be a younger offensive line, and for each player that was a good player worth having for an extended amount of time, they would be a cheaper offensive line over the next few seasons. Maybe not necessarily in 21 because they've got good value here across the board in 21, but over the next few seasons, we would already be set up that way. Why is offensive line so important? Why is it so different? And it is. Offensive line is different from every other position group in football for this reason. If you have a secondary that is full of kind of, you've got one guy and everybody else is just patchwork, you can always shrink that secondary down to about four defenders on most plays, and you can insert extra linebackers or you can insert extra defensive linemen. It's a little bit different. It might not be the way you want to play football, but you understand if your secondary is weak or there's just no depth there, you can play fewer guys in the secondary and you can play more linebackers or more defensive linemen. The same thing is true with your defensive line. Even though they rotate a lot of guys in and out, if you realize that your defensive line just isn't very good, you don't have very much talent there for whatever reason, you can always go with more linebackers and you can always go with more guys in the secondary. Same thing is true with the linebacker squad, okay? If your linebackers aren't very good, a lot of NFL teams aren't, you can shrink that down to as few as 2 linebackers and play either more guys in the secondary or bring in more big bodies on the defensive line. You have a lot of flexibility there, as much as 2 to 4 players within a position group that you can kind of move your way through for most games and for most plays. When it gets over the offensive side of the football, you have the same thing when it comes to wide receivers and running backs and tight ends. If your running backs are pathetic, you don't have to give them the ball. You can start flaring the ball out to your tight ends and to your slot receivers more. You can just play them more often. If your tight ends are terrible, you don't have to go with the tight end at all. You can play the slot receivers more or go with the 2 running back set. If your wide receivers are pathetic, you can go a little bigger. You can go with 2 running backs and 2 tight ends. There's so much flexibility built into those weapons packages on the offensive side of the football. You can play your strongest players and have different numbers in each position group. Offensive line is unique. You can do that. you have to have 5 offensive linemen. And as soon as one guy goes down, you've got to have another guy go in. And because offensive linemen make more contact on plays than anybody else, even the defensive line, because like I said, the defensive line traditionally rotates people in and out. Defensive linemen, on average, even the good ones, play about 800 snaps a season. Offensive linemen, the good ones, on average, pass 1,000 snaps a season. A lot of times, defensive backs don't make a lot of head-on-head contact on plays because they're flaring out for screens or they're dropping back into pass coverage. Kind of limits how much physical attribution they're getting each play in each game. Offensive linemen are hitting somebody every single play. There are going to be more injuries to offensive linemen traditionally than any other position group. For that reason, you know you're going to have more injuries to that position group, and you always have to have 5 of them. That's where the math really kicks in, and that's where the offensive line really is different from every other position group. And you have to have 5 of them. As soon as one guy goes down, I've got to put another guy in, which really means you've got to go 8 or 9 deep, and they can't just be scrubs who play on certain plays. You can't just bring a guy in on 3rd and short or on 2nd and long. You have to have a guy who's going to play on the offensive line, and they have to be able to play together. And that's really what kicks in. And that's why I am so stubborn and so arrogant about this issue when it comes to the offensive line. Now, the ironic thing is this. When you look at the team that the Patriots, that Thuney just came from, the Patriots, they're going to miss Thuney, but they're actually still going to have a better offensive line than Kansas City next year. It's probably not going to be that close, and their finances are going to be very good on the offensive line as well, because they are one of the teams who actually invest 1 to 2 draft picks a year in the offensive line. Now, I would never pick out a single season, say 2020 or 2018, and go, oh, they didn't draft an offensive lineman this year, they blew it. That's not the way this works. But on average, as you look over 5 seasons, you should be able to look back the way I would do these things and draft 1 to 2 offensive linemen a year. That kind of should be your average. I know that doesn't work every single season. Sometimes the picks just aren't there. But the offensive line is worth investing in, and it may not show up in the first season that you do it. It may be season 2 and season 3 before you do this. And I realize Brett Veach has spent and Andy Reid has spent 1 draft pick on the offensive line last year and 1 on the offensive line the year before, and they both have a chance of starting. That's Allegretti and Niang, right? So they've invested a little bit in the past 2 seasons, but still it's not been enough. And I'm not necessarily even telling them that I'm going to be disappointed as if they care, all right, that they didn't draft 2 offensive linemen this year. But I just think it would be a good, smart thing to get yourself back on the road again, to being younger, to having more overlap in these contracts, so you don't have to deal with 6 or 7 offensive linemen changing each offseason or trying to rework new deals. It overlaps them a lot more. The younger you get, the less likely you are to be injured on the offensive line. And when you already have a good stockpile of offensive linemen, it puts less pressure on you to have to pay a lot of money to a guy like Thuney, because in your own mind, you're thinking, well, we're going to miss him, but we're not going to be devastated on the offensive line because we've invested enough draft picks to where they're continuing to be good. Now, it's easy for me to sit here and say this. It's a lot more difficult to be a real general manager and a real head coach. And the reason for it is this. It's not so much that the X's and O's are so much more difficult. It's not so much that the strategy and the planning is so much more difficult. What makes it so much more difficult in real life versus me standing here on a video talking about it is that you have the pressure of dealing with real people. You know, you've got an owner to answer to. You've got millions of fans who watch your every move, and you have them to answer to. You have a whole lot of media hawks who are watching your every move and instantly responding to it the very second you do it. You have 31 other teams in the NFL that you're competing with who would eat your heart out if they got half a chance, okay? The pressures are there, and you go back 2 or 3 years, 4 years, the pressure was there on Andy Reid to win a Super Bowl. And he may downplay that. He may kind of put that off to the side a little bit, just being a pro and doing his job. But it's undeniable that even as good a coach as he was and continues to be, that he would feel that pressure. And so the pressure is just different. I realize that the things I'm talking about here today, drafting 1 to 2 offensive linemen a year and how I think that's a better approach and blah, 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 I realize that those things don't always work out in real life. You have real people to answer to. You have a boatload of pressure. And what really starts to kick in here for most NFL teams and general managers and coaches is job security. They know for a coach, you basically got 2 to 3 years to show improvement or you're out the door. And for general managers, that window used to be something like 6 to 8 years. That window is actually shrinking for general managers as well. It's something more like 4 to 6 years now for general managers. You basically get a shot at 2 head coaches, and that might be it for you as a general manager. So job security and pressure really kicks in here. And what that does, it starts to motivate people, even smart people. I mean, very intelligent, smart people. It motivates them to make decisions for only this year and for only the short term, when really, if you were to scope out over 4 or 5 seasons, over the long term, it would be better off to do something a little bit different. Now, I don't have a problem with what the Chiefs are doing. It'll work. They'll be fine this year in 2021. They won't have a dominant offensive line. They should be fine. But as you scope out over the next 4 or 5 seasons, what you're really looking at is an offensive line that has a lot of work that needs to be done to it. And I really thought the reaction to the Super Bowl itself was vastly overdone. I really thought the national media, who didn't follow the Chiefs' offensive line story through the year with all the COVID opt-outs and the injuries, I didn't think they did justice to this at all. I thought there was a very large overreaction to what happened in the Super Bowl. But having said that, as you look back over the past 5 or 6 years and the way that the Chiefs have done it, I would have done it differently, especially, and this is one of the kickers here, especially with an eye toward the fact that even in 2018, you could look ahead a little bit and see that Fisher and Schwartz wouldn't play forever. The time would come when the Mahomes contract would kick in, and you'd want to not pay Fisher and Schwartz all that cap space so that you could help pay for the Mahomes deal and lower your offensive line cost. Well, they've lowered their offensive line cost, but because they haven't been drafting offensive line from year to year, they now have a lot of patchwork going on. They'll be fine with the patchwork for 21, but when you start trying to do that season in and season out, it kind of starts to catch up with you. Other NFL teams kind of start to catch up with you as well. So that's what's happening right there in the overall scope of things. And for those of you who care still at all, I want to talk about the Thuney deal. This is really the part where, all right, I'm going to say a lot of good things about the Thuney deal, and then I'm going to say a couple of bad things about the Thuney deal, okay? First of all, Joe Thuney is an excellent player. He's a hard worker. He's an above-average offensive lineman, okay? He's somewhere in the top 6 to 8, 6 to 10 guards in football. He's somewhere in the top 30-ish offensive linemen in all of football. You could make the argument that he's in the top 25 offensive linemen in football and that he's continuing to improve and he might even work his way into the top 20. You could also make the argument that in some games and in some seasons, he's really just in the top 35 offensive linemen in all of football. But I think it's safe to say, without too much controversy, he's somewhere in the top 30. He's not an elite offensive lineman. He's a very good offensive lineman. He's not dominant, but he is consistently above average. And while I don't think he's consistently going to be competing for first-team All-Pros, I do think he's a guy who would consistently somewhat compete for Pro Bowls. So I like Joe Thuney being on the team. I also don't have a problem with them giving this much money per se to a guard. You know, back in the 70s at some point, teams started to think, hey, left tackle is the most important spot on the offensive line because that's the blind side of the right-handed quarterbacks. And they really wanted to protect their quarterback's blind side. So they started moving the best offensive linemen over to left tackle, and they started paying that position more money. As you got through the 80s and 90s, the NFL teams decided, you know, we've got edge rushers on both sides, so we're going to make right tackle the second most important piece of our puzzle here on the offensive line. And right tackle started making more money, and getting more attention than the interior of the offensive line. What we've seen over the past decade, and really this to a degree, this has always been true, because I've always felt like left and right tackle got too much money and too much draft picks and too much attention. And I know that goes against the grain of most NFL offensive coordinators, against the grain of most NFL personnel and draft personnel, and that's just the way it's going to have to be. I've always felt like for probably 30 years now, left tackle and right tackle have just gotten too much attention and too much money and too many draft picks, because what we found is pressure up the middle can make a quarterback just as uncomfortable, if not more so, than pressure around the edge, because smart quarterbacks like a Tom Brady can always just step up and throw the ball or dump it off when they're getting pressure around the edge. But pressure up the middle really makes quarterbacks uncomfortable. Even quarterbacks who are mobile and like to run and like to get out of the pocket, they do not get as much time or as much freedom when they're getting pressure up the middle from a good defensive tackle or from a pair of decent defensive tackles. The interior of that offensive line can often be just as important. The second thing we're seeing here over the past decade is that quarterbacks and offenses are getting rid of the football so fast these days that a lot of times edge rushers, even good ones, don't have time to get to the quarterback before the quarterback has already let go of the football. They are just that fast, and NFL defenses in some cases are helping them. I think one of the most glaring examples of this we saw was Thanksgiving Day, the game between the Cowboys and the Washington football team last year. Washington just kept passing the football off to the running backs who were just wide open. The Cowboys defense, which was horrendous last year, was almost willfully letting these running backs just be open all over the football field. And even though the Cowboys have some good edge rushers, it wasn't doing the Cowboys any good, because long before those edge rushers could get there, Washington and Alex Smith had already dumped the ball off to one of these running backs and picked up anywhere from 5 to 20 yards. Now, that's a glaringly obvious extreme example, but it shows to illustrate what is happening in the NFL right now. A lot of NFL defenses are switching over to more zones, purposely leaving up holes that they don't really want to try to cover everything. They just want to cover the deep ball and not get beat deep as much by some of these extremely fast wide receivers. And they're leaving holes in the zones open for tight ends and for running backs, and quarterbacks as a result can get rid of the ball so fast that edge rushers can't get there. The quickest way to get to a quarterback, or to at least make him uncomfortable, is bringing in defensive tackles who can get pressure right up the middle, or by blitzing up the middle, and that's exactly what the Chiefs are doing this year. They've already got Chris Jones at defensive tackle. They've added Jaron Reed, who plays his best at defensive tackle, attacking the A-gaps. Okay, so that's really what's happening here. And the result of all of that is that the interior offensive lineman, that's a long rabbit hole right there, but the interior offensive lineman can be just as important as your left and right tackles. So I don't have any problem with them transferring money from the tackle positions over to the guard spot. I don't have any problem with Thuney as a player. I could stand here and say all kinds of good things about him. He's good in pass blocking. He's good in run blocking. He's mobile. He's tough. He's athletic. He's fluid. He uses his hands well. I mean, I could just go on and on and on about Joe Thuney, the player. What I don't like necessarily is Joe Thuney, the deal. So this is kind of part of the video where I put on my accountant's visor and I sit in the corner like a crotchety old Scrooge and I complain about the price of bread and the attitude of today's younger generation, right? I don't like the Thuney deal because it's so much money invested in one player. And I understand, once again, I'm going directly against the grain of most NFL player personnel people and front office managers, okay? I well understand that most people in the NFL and most people out of the NFL do not agree with me on this, but I'm perfectly happy being on the island by myself if that's what it takes. Putting this much money into one position, it's going to be, starting in 2022, it's going to be about $18 million for a couple of seasons, and then I think in 2023 it goes up to $19 million. The problem with that is this. If Thuney is the best player you've got on the offensive line, and right now he is by a pretty wide margin, if he gets injured, and again, I know he hasn't gotten injured yet, He's played 5 years, hasn't missed a game. He might not have missed a snap for all I know, but he hasn't missed a game. Keep in mind, you could say the same thing about Mitchell Schwartz before this season. He'd played, I think, 7 or 8 seasons without missing a game. At some point, these guys are going to get injured. The guys who are the most likely to get injured are the guys who play the most snaps. Offensive linemen play more snaps than anybody. So really, one of the most likely guys you have to get injured is Joe Thuney, simply because of how many snaps he plays. But even if he's healthy, you've still got a lot of money tied up in just one position. That's kind of putting all your eggs in one basket. If he goes out, you have no more difference makers on the offensive line. You have several guys who can hold their own. They can be decent starters. They can plug a hole. They'll be fine for a season. They're not going to be bleeding and just creating huge problems on the offensive line for the most part. Thuney's your only difference maker. And so you've invested so much money into that one spot. If Thuney were to go down, you don't get that money back to spread around the offensive line again. You've got just who you've got. You've got to plug that hole, and then you've got to kind of carry on with what is, in some instances, kind of a patchwork offensive line. So that's really where I have a problem with it. I don't hate the Thuney deal. You didn't give up any draft picks to get him, so that's important. If you want to get out of the Thuney deal after 3 seasons, if injuries kick in, or if he's just not the player that we all know him to be from New England, after 3 seasons, you can get out of the deal pretty cheaply. But that's really where I have the problem, not just with the Thuney deal, but with any mega deal that gives this much money to one player. It's one of the moves that you see teams down at the bottom of the league do a lot. They have a position group that they're concerned about, and so they'll dive out into free agency and they'll throw a lot of money at one player and hope to kind of anchor down that entire position group with just this one player. Now, the problem with that, and we'll get to Thuney back specifically in a second, but the problem with that with any player, I don't care who it is you've tied so much money up there to fix one spot. You still have 50-some other spots on the football team to field, and it just gets tougher and tougher when you tie up that much money into one player. The specific thing that really I wouldn't like about the Thuney deal is how much money we're paying him. I said before, he's somewhere in the top 6 or 8 of offensive guards in football. He's also somewhere in the top 30-ish of offensive linemen. But he's getting paid like one of the top 6 offensive linemen in football. Not this year, not in 21. His cap hit is incredibly low. It goes scaling skyward in 2022. And as of right now, he'll be basically one of the top 6 or 8 highest paid offensive linemen in all of football, when he's really only one of the top 30 offensive linemen in all of football. So you're not just paying a market price for Joe Thuney. You are paying an absolute peak of the mountain market price that nobody else has ever offered to Joe Thuney, and that's why he came to play for you. You're paying the market price plus, basically is what you're doing. Thuney basically, with the amount of money that he's making, he would have to be playing at an all-pro level to even justify what some people would call the market price. Now, I don't like paying market prices anyway. I see several NFL teams who have very smartly, and Buffalo honestly is one of the teams who is doing this. The Patriots are another team who has done this for a very long time. When you draft guys and you can identify them in year 2 or year 3 as a guy you want to keep, you can sign them to a long-term deal and save a lot of money, 20 to 30% off of what you would have to pay a guy coming in off the market. Joe Thuney here with the Chiefs is making the kind of money that goes beyond even what a market price is. It is market price plus. And like I said, Thuney would basically have to stay healthy for every season, and he would basically have to be playing like an all-pro to even justify this price, if you're even okay with putting this much money into one position, which I personally, as playing the role of the grouch here, am not in support of doing that. But I don't hate this. When you've got Joe Thuney, everything that I said before about him that was good is still true, okay? He's still an excellent player. He still may get better. He's going to help the offensive line. I have no problem with the fact that he's a guard versus a tackle. He comes from an organization that knows how to win to an organization that already knows how to win. You've got a guy here who has a good track record of not being injured. All of that is true. I still like Thuney the player. Kansas City is going to love having him. The offensive line is going to love having him. But just keep in mind, you're paying not only for every single thing you're getting from him, you're paying more than what you're actually probably going to get from him. You've got a lot of money tied up here in that one spot, okay? So that's my own way of doing things. Kansas City, I understand what they're doing with the Thuney deal. And, you know, I think I've said enough about that, okay? So that's the long-term stuff. Again, this is not as exciting. It's a little bit more boring stuff today, but it's exciting to me here on the nerd side of things. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk more about the offensive line as the offseason goes on. When the draft picks start to come in, when training camp starts to kick through, we'll have a lot more to talk about here with this offensive line. This is just what we've got so far here with the Thuney deal and with the draft picks over the last several seasons. All right, thank you a whole bunch. We'll see you next time. Bye.